In this lecture, we turn to look at the internal evidence part of the methodology for textual criticism. The eclectic method in textual criticism says that we should weigh each text critical problem on its own rather than have a general principle, for example, of following every reading that a certain manuscript favors or even a certain manuscript type favors. We're going to look at each piece of evidence on its own, and that includes both the external and the internal evidence. So in our methodology, we mustn't just give all the evidence to the manuscript witnesses. We also have to evaluate what's going on with authors and scribes. Looking at this slide, you can see then that by the time we get to this point in our application of the methodology for textual criticism, we have sorted out the different readings in the manuscripts. You will have put into a chart what the different readings are and sorted out things from the apparatus reading to show that you actually can read the apparatus and you can interpret it. And then related to that, you will have evaluated the external evidence according to the date of manuscripts, the geographical distribution of manuscripts, and then the text types or preferred value of certain manuscripts. The internal evidence then is going to look at two major factors. One is, what is the author likely to have said? A quick example would be, does Paul use this word often, or does he never use this word? Does he use this grammatical construction often in his writings, or does he never use this kind of thing? Would he have likely to have said this sort of thing in the first century or the second century, and so forth? What would the author likely have written? What do the scribes tend to do? What are the scribal characteristics that can influence the copying of manuscripts? And there are a lot of possibilities to consider there. Once you have evaluated everything, external and internal evidence, then you come up with an argument for why the reading that you chose is likely the original reading. But you also need to try to argue why the other readings were likely to have come into existence. And so this is then the general approach to text criticism that we're applying in this course. You can also, having done your own work, then check to see what other scholars have come up with in the commentaries, in even the Metzger's textual commentary, and see whether they agree or disagree with you. Do show your own work. Do not simply quote Metzger or some commentary and think that that is adequate work. You have to show that you can understand this, you can apply the methodology, and make your own argument. Other scholars' work is corroborating evidence, or it is an opportunity to discuss debates on the possible reading, but you don't simply rely on it. What was an author more likely to have written? Arguments about what the author was likely to have written can be quite tentative. Indeed, this kind of a question has led people sometimes to say, well, Paul couldn't have written 1 Timothy because the vocabulary is just too different, and the way in which he writes is too different, and so forth. It may be that he used a scribe. It may be that he has had several more years of using Greek. Who knows what the reason is? I think these arguments can be quite tentative, but nevertheless we should give it a go and see what might pop up. So we do want to look here at the author's vocabulary, grammar, theology, and also consider things around the time of writing. Let's take an example. In 1 Corinthians 13, verse 3, we read this in the New Revised Standard Version. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Notice the Greek. The phrase, so that I may boast, is translating hina kaukesomai. Kaukesomai. Now, notice the word below on the slide, kauthesomai. Obviously, they sound very similar. There are two letters that have been changed. The chi has been changed to a theta, and the omega in omai has been changed to an omicron, or the other way round. But once you change that to kauthesomai, the meaning changes as well, and it becomes in order to be burned. If I give up my body in order to be burned. So what does the text read? In actual fact, there's very strong external evidence for both readings. But as you consider Paul's vocabulary, you realize that he never uses the word kauthesomai, but he does often talk about kaukesomai, boasting. It's one of his themes. Furthermore, the idea of giving up your body to be burned doesn't apply that well to the time of Paul's writing for the early church. It was in the 60s, 10 years plus after writing 1 Corinthians, that the early Christians first experienced being burned for their faith when Nero ordered their execution and they were burned in Rome. And then, of course, subsequent persecutions did see Christians being burned into the 2nd century and so forth. So was Paul likely to have written that I give up my body to be burned? So far the argument suggests no. However, in 2 Maccabees we do read about the martyrs who are put to death, and they are chopped up and burned. And so it is possible that that reference could be from Paul. He just doesn't tend to use the word. You can see then how tentative these arguments can be. But this is one kind of thing to consider as you discuss internal evidence. The second part of considering internal evidence has to do with the scribes. What were scribes likely to do? And we can answer that, first of all, in terms of what were they intentionally likely to do. This just comes from observing many manuscripts and saying, you know what, this is quite interesting. The scribes tend to do this sort of thing. Or they tend to do this sort of thing in this area of the world in copying and not in that area. That leads to a distinction, for example, between the Egyptian text type and the Western text type. Western text type is characterized by wild copying. So that would be an intentional example of what scribes might do. But then also, scribes allow errors to creep into the manuscripts unintentionally. If you have copied somebody else's notes in class, if you missed the class and are using their manuscript and are looking back and forth from what's on the page that they wrote to the page that you're writing, you know the kinds of errors that scribes were likely to have done, even well-trained scribes. And well-trained scribes can be very tired scribes at times. Or it can be that there's a whole group of scribes in a classroom setting, and someone is reading the text, and they just hear something different. They don't hear kaukesomai, they hear kauthesomai, for example. And this is the sort of thing then that you consider as you discuss the scribes' habits. And here are some examples. What I'm going to do is go through the types of errors that they make and not look specifically at the examples on these slides. You can go back and look at those yourself or pause on the slide for a bit. These are taken from the text of the New Testament by Kurt Alland and Barbara Alland, or by Bruce Metzger's book by the same title, The Text of the New Testament. So first of all, continuous script. Where should a break come? If scribes aren't used to punctuating material, and if even words flow together rather than you have a little space between them, errors can easily creep in. There can be confusion of letters. A double lambda can look like a mu, for example, in capital letters. Another kind of scribal error is referred to by the words dittography and haplography. And here you're being introduced to some technical terms in textual criticism. You know the word ditto, and that's what dittography is, where you repeat something. And haplography would be where you omit something. So in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, the question is, has to do with the first two words that you can see here on the slide. Notice that the ending of the first word is a nu, and the beginning of the second word is a nu. So the question is, did a scribe happen to omit haplography, the second nu, and end up with apioi? Or was the scribe adding a second nu and ending up with napioi? That comes out to the question of, was Paul saying we became gentle or we became babes? Napioi is babes, babies. Scribal fatigue also is associated with some technical terms in textual criticism. Homoioteliuton has to do with a passage where words have the same letters at the end. And you can see a scribe looking back and forth to a page and skipping something or repeating something again because of these words looking alike. Homoiarchton is similar. It's where the same letters are at the beginning of the words. Fatigue might account for this, just not paying carefully enough attention to the fact that these are different words. Misinterpreted homonyms. Words that sound alike could be misunderstood. And again, this would have to do most likely with someone reading the text and scribes writing down what they hear. We can put an emphasis in the way we speak Greek on a difference between hemes, we, and humes, you. But in actual fact, the words sounded quite similar in speaking Greek. And this is one of the common errors that you find in the New Testament. Does the text read us, or we, rather, and does it read you? That would be an example, then, of misinterpreted homonyms. Punctuation can be an issue, and if they didn't use punctuation, then the first thing to note is that when you see punctuation in the Greek, that is someone later from the original author adding the punctuation. And punctuation eventually did creep in to manuscripts. And so even at the copying stage of manuscripts, not just in our day, we begin to see some questions about where the punctuation should come. But also then the lack of punctuation in the original manuscripts leads to different interpretations sometimes as to what's really being said. Number 7 has to do with similar words. Is it eudokia, goodwill to men, in Luke 2:14, or eudokias, among men with whom he is pleased, would be the translation of the phrase in which eudokias is found. So external evidence in this case favors the former, but internal evidence favors the latter, as Alland argues in Luke 2:14. And notice 1 Corinthians 13:3 here is brought up as an example of similar words, kauthesomai and kaukesomai. Number 8, intentional changes. Now, this is something that we are surprised at, because our whole desire in textual criticism is to restore what the original manuscript read. And so it's very irritating to come to this and discover that some scribes were actually intentionally making changes. And why would they do that? They might want to explain something because it's unclear. They might even think that something is a little bit theologically off and want to clarify that this isn't saying that. So, for example, in John's Gospel, Jesus says that he is not going up to the temple, and then he does? Or is he saying not yet going up to the temple, and then he does follow the disciples to the temple? That kind of question might be solved by the internal evidence of a scribe intentionally changing something, because since Jesus did go to the temple, he must have said not yet and not the word not going to the temple. That would be the logic there. Now, it could also be that a scribe wants to polish up the style. This needs to be a subjunctive, not an indicative. This needs to have not only a different word, but a different kind of grammar or whatever. And so intentional changes can come about not because someone's trying to change the theology of the text, but just to have the text read better. Scribes might also decide to alter the word order. It read better to them, or use some other word, a synonym. Maybe this has to do with regional differences or changes of the language over the hundreds of years following the original manuscript being written. For whatever reason, the scribe might intentionally alter the word order, use a synonym, or make some other kind of change like that. Now, Jews had a very strong sense of not changing the word because the very word was holy. Greeks didn't tend to share that Oriental view. As Alon suggests, for the Greeks, it was the message that contained what was sacred. And so he points to Porphyry, who appeals to the gods that he has added or deleted nothing, only corrected faulty readings. Notice that. I haven't added or deleted anything. I've only corrected a few things. Improving the clarity, supplying minor omissions, omitting irrelevant accretions, but the meaning of the words I preserved faithfully. Now, it may well be that Christians often took on the same view that the Jews had of holy writing. But it may also be that in the history of Christianity, some of the scribes held to a different view. And they didn't think that they were altering anything really, like Porphyry, but just changing a few things. Also, we might consider the case of Mark 16, 9 through 20, in regard to the tenacity of an original reading in the manuscript tradition. In this case, we have quite an interesting phenomenon. 99% of Greek manuscripts have the long ending of Mark. 99%. This seems an overwhelming argument in favor of adding this longer passage. But in actual fact, this just shows that there is still a tenacity of holding on to the original reading, where the 1% continues to copy manuscripts that end in Mark 16, verse 8. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, two of our strongest manuscripts, end with Mark 16, verse 8, and a number of other manuscripts according to Eusebius in the early 4th century and Jerome in the early 5th century, and the Sinaitic Syriac, some Old Latin, one Sahidic manuscript, the earliest Georgian manuscript that we have, and many Armenian manuscripts. So that's the 1% that do not have the longer ending. Despite most manuscripts having this longer ending, the point is the shorter ending still holds tenaciously through the centuries. So the argument against the long ending of Mark is that better manuscripts, even though they're few, far fewer, better manuscripts don't have the longer ending. And then there are also some other internal arguments about vocabulary and apparent copying from Matthew's ending and so forth that play into the larger discussion. This point is simply about the tenacity of the original reading, even when the manuscript tradition goes wrong. And finally, there are theological and pastoral alterations to the text that we sometimes find. On the pastoral side, perhaps the example might be the woman caught in adultery in John 7:53 to 8:11. If you skip this story and read the text in John from 7:52 and then pick up in chapter 8, verse 12, there's just a smooth reading of the text. When you look at the manuscript tradition, you see that this story of the woman caught in adultery appears in different places in manuscripts of John, suggesting that someone has inserted it. And you could look at other reasons text critically that would suggest to you ultimately that, indeed, the woman caught in adultery is not part of the original text of John's Gospel. But it preaches well. And so for pastoral concerns, people want the story there. And once it appears somewhere in the text, copyists are trying to find a good place to put it in. 1 John 5:7 through 8, our great example here in textual criticism, is a wonderful passage to use to talk about the Trinity, even though it is an insertion into the text. The Lord's Prayer has an ending that is clearly not part of the original text in Matthew's Gospel, and yet it's the ending that we still say today when we learn the Lord's Prayer. And so forth. Again, Mark 16:9 through 20, just to bring up this issue again in this last point. Mark's Gospel ends in verse 8, really? Where the women are afraid and they don't go tell anybody anything? Is that any way to end a Gospel? And so we have to say, maybe the real ending of Mark was lost, or maybe Mark wanted to leave a challenge to the church in Rome undergoing persecution, not to be like the women, but still to remain bold in their proclamation of the risen Christ. Different suggestions like these have been given by scholars, but we want a better ending to Mark's Gospel, and so there's not so much theological reasoning, but you might just say editorial reasoning. You want a conclusion like Mark 16. Jesus has already been raised from the dead before verse 9, so there is that kind of a conclusion to the text, but you need better resolution, it feels like, than women who are scared being the conclusion of the book. This then concludes our look at the internal evidence, what the author was likely to have said and what scribes were likely to do. We next move to look at rules for textual criticism.